Okay, here we go. So we've been running through the meal. We spoke about um, preparing to eat, eating before one eats, washing, how we say hamotzi, how we eat like a mensch, and most recently we spoke about which foods require their own bracha during the meal. And the general rule of thumb is, just to summarize what we did yesterday, any food that is regularly eaten as part of a meal and not as a dessert is included in hamotzi. Any food or drink which is not usually eaten in a meal, but rather as a dessert, as a treat, such as fruits, require their own bracha. And we had the interesting discussion about if you want to have a scotch or a vodka, that actually depends on the region. If you're in a place where it's common practice for people to have a scotch or a whiskey during a meal, then that would be included in the hamotzi. If it's a place where people do not, then you would make a separate bracha on it. And the solution the Kitzur mentioned was to have something else that has the same bracha that is definitely not a meal food, to make a bracha on that other food, and that will cover you for your scotch as well. So if you're going to have a jelly bean or a piece of chocolate or anything that is not a meal food, and you'll say a shahakal on that, and you can have in mind that that covers the l'chaim as well, then you're sorted. So we're finished eating, and now it is time to bench. Now, before we bench, we need to wash our hands. Just as there is a requirement, or I should say, just as there is a requirement for us to wash our hands before we start the meal, before we say hamotzi, and the rabbis also instituted a requirement for us to wash our hands when we finish the meal, when it's time to bench. Now, why do we need to wash our hands when it's time for to bench? So there are two reasons brought in the Shulchan Aruch. The one reason is because people would come in contact with a very sharp salt, and which they touched while they were eating, and were they to touch their eyes, it would literally be blinding. And therefore, as soon as one is finished eating, one should be rinsing off one's fingertips so that one doesn't have the salt on one's fingertips and doesn't come to blind one's eyes. Now, although this reason is not so relevant today, because we don't generally eat with our fingers, and even if we do, we don't have dangerous salts. But there's a second reason that's brought in the Shulchan Aruch for why we wash our hands before we bench. And that is that benching is obviously it's like davening. Just as one is required, and it's a requirement that before one davens, one has to wash one's hands. We just learned earlier, a couple of months ago, that in fact, if a person should travel as far as 4 kilometers, which we said is walking. If it's driving, then we're talking about an hour and 12 minutes. A person should travel an hour and 12 minutes ahead on his journey just to be able to wash his hands before he davens. Or if it's in the opposite direction, a kilometer backwards, which would be about a 20-minute drive in the opposite direction each way, 18 minutes, just to be able to wash one's hands before davening. Now, as great as davening is, benching is also huge. It's actually one of the 613 mitzvahs. So we have a requirement after having bread and becoming full to bless Hashem. And certainly we do not want to be talking to Hashem when our hands are dirty. So therefore, the rabbi said that one is required to wash one's hands, or at least one's fingertips, before one benches. Now, the Shulchan Aruch says that this was only a requirement in a time when people were pedantic about their hands being clean. But in the times of the Shulchan Aruch said that nowadays people are not so particular as far as the level of their cleanliness, and therefore it is not considered disrespectful to bench without having washed one's hands, because it's normal for a person's hands not to be perfectly clean. Now that's what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. I would say that today we are more particular about having our hands perfectly clean. Maybe especially in Corona times when we're constantly looking to keep super clean. So since the Gemara and Shulchan Aruch already mentioned this concept of not wanting to bless and talk to Hashem while our hands are dirty, so this concept of mayim achronim, of washing our fingers, our fingertips before we bench, today is all the more relevant, not so much for the sodomite salt, but more because we're about to talk to Hashem, and our hands should be clean before we do that. Now, it's interesting to note that today it's pretty much only customary for men to wash their hands, this washing mayim achronim before benching, and not women. Why that is, I'm not sure. But what we will discover when we look at the text inside is that the Shulchan Aruch mentions that there are certain communities that were not particular about washing their hands before they benched. And since that became the standard practice, not out of negligence or, carelessness, but rather as a custom of the community, the Shulchan Aruch mentions that there are certain communities that actually don't wash their hands before benching at all. However, this is only if you know that you have such a custom, but otherwise one is required. It's an absolute obligation to wash one's hands before benching. It's not just a custom, it's an obligation. It's just an interesting phenomenon that if one is in a community where the custom is not to wash one's hands, then that obligation falls away. But if one is not part of such a community, then there is an obligation. So I would say based on that, perhaps that's why today men wash and women don't. It probably had to do with what became the accepted practice. So you have this interesting phenomenon. People often say it's important to distinguish between halacha, which is the law, and the minhag, which is a custom. And that's true. It is important to differentiate. Some things are a requirement and some things are only a custom. But where it gets a little bit more nuanced is that sometimes custom does determine halacha. And the classical example of that are Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. For an Ashkenazi to have kidneys on Pesach is against the law. The halacha, the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law forbids an Ashkenazi from having kidneys, from having rice on Pesach. For a Sephardi, it is absolutely permissible. So sometimes it's the law, sometimes it's the custom, and sometimes the custom determines the law. Which I understand may sound a little bit tricky, but that's how it is. And mayim achronim is one of them. It's the law, one is required to wash one's hands before benching. However, if one has a custom not to, then that law doesn't apply to them. It's not determined by the person himself, but rather the custom of his community or his ancestry. And maybe that's why women today, in that way, are not required to wash before benching, because their custom was that the law didn't apply to them. Now, just to maybe explain a little bit more, you might be wondering, how could it be? How could it be? Either it's law, it's custom. How could custom affect the law? So part of the tradition that was passed down from Moshe, from Sinai, from Moses, was that the rabbis have the authority and the power to affect Jewish law. Okay, there are many examples of this. The idea of not having chicken and milk, or the idea of not muktzah, of not touching a pen on Shabbos. These are laws that were instituted by the sages, and the Torah gives them that authority. And once the rabbis instituted these laws, they became legally binding. In fact, in temple times, a person would even be able to receive the whip, stripes of rebellion, for not listening to the words of the sages. So the words of the sages are certainly not suggestion, but rather they're an absolute obligation. That's part of what's written in the Torah. One of the 613 mitzvahs are that you shouldn't deviate. Lo yisasuru, and shouldn't deviate from what the sages have told us. And that's a mitzvah. Now, as far as the meaning of that mitzvah, part of the tradition that's been passed down is that when the rabbis instituted a law, it would have to be practiced by the majority of the community. If the majority of the community did not follow suit, they did not listen to the sages, then that institution of the sages actually is not legally binding. By the way, we're not talking about a wise person today. We're talking about the rabbis a few thousand years ago, like Mordechai in the story of Purim. We're talking about rabbis that literally had the authority on a different level. It exists to some extent today. It does. That's the power of a Beis Din. But so a condition for the authority that the Torah gives to the rabbis to innovate law, there are many conditions. They have to have that authority, and they need to be in line and have the tradition, etc. Not anybody can get up and do it. But one of the conditions is that the law has to have been accepted by a majority of the community. If the law was not accepted by the majority of the community, then it drops. Then it doesn't apply. Then it doesn't kick in. It's quite fascinating. I'll give you an example of that.
Mm-hmm.
The sages at a certain point instituted that a man is not allowed to daven until he goes to mikveh, especially if he was intimate with his wife. I'm not sure if it was especially or only. I think only. If a man was involved in sexual relations, he would be forbidden to pray, to daven, until the man went to mikveh. Today we speak about mikveh for a woman, but the sages instituted that a man, Ezra, one of the sages, instituted that a man is forbidden to pray until he goes to mikveh. However, this was something that was hard in being achieved, and it was never accepted by the majority of the Jewish people in any communities. And so therefore today, it is no longer a law. Since, however, Ezra attempted to establish this as a law, and it was not accepted, so it is not legally binding, but in Hasidic communities, for example, Hasidic men are particular based on this to go to a men's mikveh every morning before they daven. So that this is just an interesting example of how, although the Torah gives the sages the authority to institute law, the condition is that it had to have been accepted by a majority of the community. So that is why custom affects law. Because the condition of rabbinic law is that it's practiced originally when it was instituted by the majority of the observant community. We're not talking about people that are ignorant or unobservant or not involved. We're talking about the observant community. Any law that was practiced by the majority of the observant community of the sages becomes law. And if it's not practiced when it was instituted, then it's not law. It's at most custom. So that is why custom affects law. So although today's class was officially about Maya Machronim, about washing our hands before we bench, I just thought maybe it's quite a fascinating one. People are often intrigued about what the story is with washing one's hands before one's benches, and this is one of those examples where it is a law, it's an obligation, but based on custom. So if you have a custom not to, then it's not legally binding, such as for women or certain people. But if you don't have any such custom, then it is legally binding. So we've spoken about, is it custom or is it law? We've spoken about the reasons for washing our hands before benching. With all that said, let's look through the text. Okay, so we find that many people are lenient regarding the law of washing their hands at the end of a meal. However, it is proper for every God-fearing person, meaning any person that is trying to develop a better relationship with Hashem, to observe this law scrupulously, to be particular about it. You are required to wash only up to the second knuckle, holding your hands downwards before drying them, because you don't want it to go onto the rest of your hand. The one needing benching should be the one to wash first. So this that he says up to the second knuckle, Chabad custom, again, custom is affecting law. Chabad custom is actually only to wash the very fingertips, not even up to the second knuckle, which is quite interesting. So again, there's law and there's custom. She says one should be particular about it. By the way, a good practical example about this is if you're going on a drive and you want to have a sandwich. So before you leave, you wash your hands and you say Hamotzi in the house, so that you're saying Hamotzi right where you washed your hands. And you have a bite, you have a kazayas, a slice, and then you have in mind when you say Hamotzi that you're going to continue to eat the sandwich in the car. That's fine. However, when you finished eating the sandwich, then you need to stop and bench wherever you finished. You can't wait to bench because you need to bench wherever you finished eating. But you need to first wash your hands. So this is actually, one needs to remember if one's taking a sandwich into the car to also take a water bottle or any cup of water so that one will also be able to wash one's hands before one benches, as we see that this is somewhat of a requirement. Okay, now this water is considered really dirty. It's like putrid. Therefore, don't wash on the ground where people walk, because a damaging spirit dwells on this water. But rather wash into a vessel or under the table and dry your hands and then bench. There should be no interruption between between washing the hands and benching. This is particularly relevant at a Shabbos table where you're passing it around, and while you're waiting for everybody to wash your hands, maybe you'll have a few conversations going. That's not allowed. One is not allowed to make any interruption between, just as one shouldn't interrupt between washing one's hands between at the beginning of the meal. One shouldn't interrupt between washing the hands and saying hamotzi. One is not allowed to interrupt between washing one's hands at the end of the meal, although one doesn't make a bracha, and benching. Okay. Do not remove the tablecloth or bread from the table. So we've spoken about washing the hands, but now as far as benching is concerned, we should leave bread on the table until after benching. Bread should also be on the table at the time of benching to demonstrate the abundance of goodness from Hashem. So by having that little bit of challah left on the table, we're like, wow, Hashem, look how much you've blessed us with. That He's given us so much that we even have to spare. As Elisha the prophet said, for so said Hashem, eat and leave over. Achol v'hoter. Another reason for this custom is that Hashem's blessing has no effect on a void, on emptiness. It is only effective on some existing substance. As Elisha says to the wife of Obadiah, what do you have in the house? It's a famous story, but since it's 5:19, I'm not going to have time to go into it now. But so yes, so when benching, one can clear the table of any mess, but should leave bread on the table while one is benching. Okay, we'll stop over here because this is a long one. Please God, tomorrow we'll continue discussing the other laws of benching and the conclusion of the meal. Thanks so much for joining, and wishing you